it's really a great pleasure to be flanked by two award-winning star journalists who have not only reported for many years from many parts of the world, but also who have each got off a flight. Roger from Moscow yesterday, Luke from Kyiv yesterday, last week. So they're hot off the press, so to speak. So we thought we would start. I have a number of questions. It's quite challenging. There's so much we can talk about. So I'm trying to impose some order. But what we are talking about is also so grim that any moments of levity are entirely intentional and deliberate, just so that it doesn't get too grim. I should say before we start that you heard about the other Pulitzers. Roger's just won another one last month for his essay, The Making of Vladimir Putin. And I think it deserves a round of applause, don't you? So really, I'm sure people want to hear your very fresh accounts. Luke, you've been filing stories in The Guardian very regularly. You wrote about the recent attack on the dam. You've just returned from Kyiv. Why don't you just give us some first impressions?
Yeah, I mean, we've come a terrific way. I mean, I was in Kyiv on February the 24th when the invasion started. I always thought it was going to happen with Vladimir Putin. When there's a bad option and a really bad option, always go with really bad, because that's generally where you land. But back then, the mood was one of fear and dread. The expectation, certainly in Washington, London, in Kyiv itself, is that the capital would fall and the Russians would prevail. Now, that hasn't happened. We've seen an extraordinary fight back, counteroffensives, which I covered for The Guardian last autumn successfully in the northeast around Kharkiv Oblast, and in the south, liberating the city of Kherson. And of course, now all eyes are turning to Zaporizhia, to Donetsk, where there's a kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive which has just begun. I mean, it's too early to say whether it's going to work or not. But I think, what we can say is that Putin has failed. His plan was to subjugate Ukraine, to wipe it from the map, and to restore it as a kind of colony, really, or province, a lost province of Russia. That didn't work, and we're now at the stage where he's trying to hang on to everything that he got and to kind of entrench. And Ukraine, meanwhile, has survived as a sovereign state. It has proved itself. It is de-Russifying, decolonizing. I've been going to Ukraine for 15 years. It's changing with astonishing speed and momentum. It is a European city. Kyiv is a great place where, despite the war, there is good coffee, there are restaurants, there are hipsters, a bit like here, going up and down the cobbled streets. Everything is okay until it isn't. And then every night you go to bed at midnight, about 2 a.m., there's the wail of an air raid siren, and it's terrifically loud, and you can't go back to sleep because within about sort of 10 or 15 minutes there are explosions. There are explosions as Kyiv's air defense engages. There is tracer fire in the sky. There are bombs. 4 in the morning, you get the all clear, but by that point, you're so full of adrenaline, you can't sleep for another hour. This has been going on for months. And basically, to wrap up, what Putin is trying to do is to try and wear down and terrorize Ukrainians so they eventually submit. And there's one other kind of calculation, which is that he thinks the West, the UK, the Biden administration, maybe with Trump coming back in 2024, that we will eventually flake, and that will present further opportunities for him. So he thinks he can win this war, and that he will outlast us, that his appetite for pain is greater, both receiving it and inflicting it, and is calculating on a long war. And we have to see. It's a sort of test for our resolve, a test for the West's resolve.
Thank you, Luke. In fact, I would urge you, Invasion is on sale outside, and it's really incredibly moving to read the way you open the book with the morning of when the invasion starts, and how visceral that description is. It's very evocative. And we will talk about it later, what it is really to be living in a war zone like this, to be there, to do the miles, to get out, to report on a daily basis from what is happening. And we want to talk about that process of writing and journalism a bit later. But Roger, if I may turn to you, as Luke and others have talked about Russia as the mafia state, which had one particular kind of structural set of actors, of oligarchs, stealing money, supporting, feeding it to their cronies. This kind of high-risk invasion, does it threaten that kind of mafia state? Does it cause weaknesses within it?
Well, thank you, Mukulika, and thank you all, and it's great to be here with you, Luke. Well, I've just come back I left Moscow yesterday after 4 weeks, or a month really, in Russia. I don't know why I got a visa, but I did. I think I was the only American correspondent in Russia during that time, after the unconscionable detention of Evan Gershkovich, who continues to languish in jail on false accusations of espionage. And indeed, I was in the courthouse a couple of weeks ago with his parents when there was a hearing which very predictably simply prolonged his detention until the end of August. And this may end ultimately with some kind of exchange with a Russian prisoner in the United States that Mr. Putin wants, but that could go on a long time. So it was pretty lonely. There was a lot of pressure. The lines keep shifting of what is a state secret in Russia, the people you're not supposed to speak to, the places you're not supposed to go. But I was able in the end to work for this period of time. In answer to your question, no, I don't think there is any immediate threat to President Putin. I think his hold on power has been consolidated to such a degree over the last 23 years that, alas, there is effectively no powerful opposition. Navalny's imprisoned, Nemtsov is dead, Politkovskaya is dead, he's murdered his opponents, he's crushed his opponents, he has no qualms about killing, and we know that, whether on a large scale or a small one. And he is surrounded by an entourage, a circle that has been with him pretty much since Petersburg days, many of them, i.e. 2 decades plus. And yes, there are plenty of oligarchs who don't like the fact you can't do business with Europe anymore, but is the overall structure immediately threatened in any way? I don't think so. I might wish otherwise. I do. I would love to see a free Russia, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It just isn't. Now, it could be that the counteroffensive breaks through Russian lines to a degree, let's say, that cuts off the motherland, the land bridge between the motherland and annexed Crimea. If something as dramatic as that happens, then I think possibly all bets are off. I don't think it will happen. It could happen, but I don't know. I think it's very dangerous to underestimate the strategic depth of Russia. I traveled to Siberia while I was there, to a place called Ulan-Ude, which is 6,000 kilometers from Moscow, an overnight flight like London, New York, and you're only 2/3 of the way across the country when you get there. And as a gentleman called Tolstoy, descended, I think, 4th generation from the great author, and he's now the deputy head of the Duma. As he told me with great bravado while I was there, Napoleon tried, and we ended up in Paris. Hitler tried, and we ended up in Berlin. And he paused for dramatic effect and said, and Kyiv is a lot closer. Well, as Luke said, I think Putin has totally mismanaged the war. He suffered very serious setbacks. I think he wanted to wipe Ukraine from the map. That is not going to happen. He's tried to readjust his objectives to continuing to control ad infinitum the 20% plus of Ukraine that he now controls. He's annexed 4 regions. That's now written into the constitution. He is not going to go back on that. He's not. So can Ukraine push him out of there and force him to recalculate? We will see.
Are you willing to hazard how it's going to end?
Well, I mean, the first thing I say is it's not going to end anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, I think the war will continue this year. It'll stretch into next year. And I mean, I agree with Roger. I mean, for Putin, a long war favors him, and for the Ukrainians, it's existential. They understand perfectly well that if they capitulate, then basically, as far as Putin is concerned, Ukrainians can be turned into good Russians, or they can be destroyed. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, you know, last year I write about this in my book. I was in Bucha just after the Russians rolled out of town at the end of March 2022. And, you know, like Roger, I mean, I think Roger's been to more places than I have, but I've done a lot of war and a lot of conflict. I was in Delhi when 9/11 happened.
It's only a matter of age, Lou. You look so much more youthful than me.
This is not true. But you know, and I was in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. I covered Russia's mini invasion of Georgia in 2008, and I was also in Ukraine in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea and kick-started a war in Donetsk and Luhansk. But actually, what I saw last year is as bad as anything. I mean, Bucha was some kind of medieval Dante hell. Basically, what happened was the Russian armored columns. I mean, the Russians, by the way, had been told that they'd be greeted by flowers as liberators. I mean, Putin either believed the kind of fantasy spun by his spy agencies, or he pretended to believe it. But essentially, he thought that Ukrainians were oppressed by neo-Nazi rulers and would welcome their liberation by Russian troops. And in fact, they were greeted with kind of fire and fury, smashed up on the outskirts of Kyiv. And what they did was they turned their kind of anger and frustration on the civilian population. And I remember going to Bucha, to a particular street called Ivano-Franko Street, where the Russian soldiers, who were all of 20, 21, 22, murdered 13 men. And I talked to one woman, Tanya, whose 24-year-old nephew, Volodya, had been taken off for interrogation by Russians who'd found his phone, something on it they didn't like, and they had taken him to a sort of yellow-painted cottage, and she climbed up an apple tree. She showed me where she'd watched, and they'd broken his arm. He was sobbing. He was covered in blood. He was put in an armored personnel carrier and taken off. And for 3 weeks, they thought he was still alive. The Russians withdrew. And then we walked down the street and turned right to a little outhouse building where they had kept Volodya for several nights. And then one night, they'd locked up. One night, they'd come in, and they'd made him kneel, and they'd shot him in the head. And I was looking at this bloodstained mattress. There was a little kid's toy next to it, and I mean, I write about it, and it haunts me. That haunts me, and the reason I tell you this is because in the Kyiv region, they did the same to about 1,600 people, civilians, buried in mass graves, executed, women raped. The same in Izum in the northeast, where I watched Ukrainian forensic officers in white boiler suits dig up graves, and a body would emerge, and you see it was wearing trousers, camouflage trousers and boots, with his hands tied, and it was a soldier. The next body would be smaller, and you think probably a woman, but it was hard to tell. They'd been in the ground for 6 months. And everybody in Ukraine gets this, that Russian occupation means murder, tyranny, rape, death, abduction of children. In short, I would say fascism on the European continent again, as it was 80, 90 years ago. And so the Ukrainians are vehement. They want to kick out all the Russians. They want to kill all the occupying Russians. There is no prospect of negotiations or a diplomatic solution. There is no prospect of a peace being mediated by Macron or someone else. So their logic is they have to carry on. And meanwhile, Putin thinks he can win. And so I fear, I hope I'm wrong, I fear this could be a war lasting 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 years. Which is depressing, but I think it's the reality.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it would be bizarre to just move on from that account and talk about something else. Roger, you just spent this intense month in Russia being followed and tailed and noted on. What kind of state of mind are you in when you're there and when you come back? I mean, does this feel slightly bizarre to be sitting here talking freely?
Yeah, it does. I think when you come back from a war zone or a police state, you realize how much tension has built up in you just because you never know when something unexpected and unpleasant might happen. And so you feel the tension slowly dissipating. It doesn't happen overnight. And there's a part of you also always that regrets leaving because such places, because the drama of it and the intensity of it and the fascination of it, even if dark, is potent. And you're not getting on the tube at Euston. I was recently in Belgorod, where there have been these Ukrainian infiltrations, attacks across the border, and has brought home the impact of some of what Luke was describing, shelling of a town of 40,000 people with pretty terrible consequences. But of course, on a very, very small scale compared to what has happened in Russia. So yeah, it's a process. I'm still in the middle of it. I agree with Luke that there's no basis for negotiation right now. I'm not quite sure what the Vatican or the Chinese or Lula or the South Africans or whoever else is right now in the negotiation game is thinking, because there's simply no basis that I can see for negotiation. On the other hand, I covered the war in Bosnia a quarter century ago, and I never thought, wars tend to end when both sides are exhausted. I think that was the case after 4 years in Bosnia, and there was also a rough balance of power, but it didn't involve, as this war does, a major nuclear power, Russia. And I think Putin has, in the end, done the very opposite of what he wanted to do, which was to wipe Ukraine. Boy, has he ever forged a Ukrainian national identity. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Odessa last year and in Mykolaiv, which was then under bombardment from the Russians, and I saw apartments blown apart and people killed. But Odessa, was a Russian city. I mean, the lingua franca is still probably Russian, or was then, and maybe is not now, founded by Catherine the Great in the 18th century. But so many people there told me that for the first time in their lives, they really felt Ukrainian. He's not only done that, he's reforged the NATO alliance, he's brought Finland and Sweden into NATO, he's cemented Ukraine in its determination to join NATO. I mean, the negative effects of what he's done from his strategic standpoint are enormous. On the other hand, as I said, the strategic depth of Russia is incalculable. And Asians are stepping in as we speak, right where the hotel I was in Moscow was full of the Chinese. I mean, Russia is turning eastward, and there are a lot of people who see opportunity in Russia, and they're coming in. And I don't think sanctions, a country with that large, with that many borders, you don't break a country like that with sanctions.
Thank you. Luke, you also wrote a book on how Russia helped Donald Trump, right? Now with the presidential elections hotting up in the US and talk of Trump's return resurfacing, is this a conversation that is at all relevant to the Ukraine war?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's horribly relevant. And just watching the Ukrainian counteroffensive, I mean, one thing that's not much talked about in Kyiv, but everyone knows about it, is if Trump wins, and it's a big if. And I guess we can ask Roger whether he thinks Trump can come back.
No, he won't.
Okay, well, hooray. Hooray. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still a phantom possibility at this stage as we sit in the summer of 2023. But you can predict. You don't have to be Nostradamus or Mystic Meg to predict what would happen. What would happen is the flow of military and other assistance from the United States, which is 20 times bigger than anyone else, Germans next, followed by the UK, would cease pretty immediately. And that would be extremely detrimental to the Ukrainians and their ability to fight back. And what we've seen so far, and what's been a source of enormous Ukrainian frustration, is a strategy from the West of what you might call incrementalism. So, first of all, Biden administration says no tanks, no F-16s, no long-range artillery, and then all of this is delivered. And all of this is, used very, very well and adroitly by Ukrainians on the battlefield, but it's always a bit late, and there's never quite enough of it. And the Russians are fighting this kind of, Roger talks about strategic depth, which is an elegant phrase, and I would say inelegantly a kind of implacable monster or a golem. I mean, it's stupid, it's big, it's lumbering, but it's got this kind of brute mass, and it will come down your high street and smash your roof in. So there are dangers of a change of administration. There are dangers of Western fatigue. What's quite interesting is that I don't detect any fatigue yet, certainly in this town with Ukraine, or a lack of interest. I mean, certainly just speaking sort of, from the metrics on the Guardian live blog, we still routinely get 1 million, 2 million people reading our live blog every day. So the engagement is there. But everyone is tired. Ukrainians are tired. I'm quite tired. Roger may be tired. And it's a kind of grueling, exhausting process. And as a journalist and a writer, I want to stick with it. But I was just talking to the editor of The Observer today, saying there's a rota of us who cover Ukraine and who race around the front line. And we could do with some younger colleagues instead of old wise people. So if there's anyone who wants to be a war correspondent, then come and see me afterwards.
In fact, speaking of young people...
I don't know how wise we are, but I'm certainly old. I don't think you are, Luke. But, there's one thing I wanted to say that... may I?
No, of course.
No, I think we have to be careful with this whole thing of Western values, and I had a conversation with Muratov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in Moscow. Extraordinary man. Politkovskaya worked for his Gazeta newspaper, as you know, and there's a shrine to her there, which was deeply moving. But he was saying to me, in the end, Putin had complete contempt for the West, and in a way, he wasn't wrong. All these people, these Western leaders would come and they would go to Politkovskaya's grave, and they would, meet a couple of distance maybe, and they would make some worthy speech. And then they would come in and see him, at the Kremlin, and they would say, well, how much oil can you sell us? How much gas can you sell us? German dependency on Russia for its gas went up exponentially after 2014, after the annexation of Ukraine, after the move into the Donbass. And all the oligarchs here, continued quite happily financing the Tory party. And then these people, would leave office, he told me. And, Schröder, the German chancellor, was immediately on the payroll of Gazprom. And Fillon, the French prime minister, was not far behind in joining the Putin payroll. And who was she? The foreign minister of Austria, followed suit. So he would just buy all these, worthy Western leaders, one after the other. And, then he had Le Pen and others. And so the writing was on the wall for a long time, We knew, as Luke said, what Putin was going to do. Did we do a damn thing about it? No, we did not. We did not. We did not. And we're paying for that now. So I think we should be a little careful when we talk of these Western values. How resolute have they been, really? And to what degree, we all want open, liberal, I think everyone in this room, believes in liberal open societies with an independent judiciary and a free press that can hold power to account. And there's none of that in today's Russia. But I think the Western performance post-Crimea and post the move into the Donbass was pretty, I live in Paris, was pretty lamentable, as the French say, pretty lamentable. Anyway, I wanted to get that off my chest.
Can I do, just two very quick points. I mean, I think Roger's completely right. Go, Roger. And there's been so much finger pointing at the Germans. You know, I used to be a Berlin correspondent, speak German.
So did I.
Well, there we are, over oil and gas. But I mean, honestly, in this town of all places, I mean, we became addicted to Russian money. Yeah. We let Russian oligarchs buy our newspapers. We let the sons of...
Chelsea Football Club.
Our football clubs let the sons of KGB officers join the House of Lords. I mean, for goodness sake, I mean, it's like a crazy soap opera. And basically, I think the more serious point is that we emboldened this behavior to the point where Putin made his miscalculation, that we were... that essentially the world was nihilistic. There were no values. He could buy people... You know, he prides himself as a master of psychology, and he could look around the room, find your vulnerability, and exploit that for his own purposes. But I would just say, you know, I mean, your book is called An Affirming Flame, but just an affirming note. What the Ukrainians would say is that they are fighting and dying for our values. Actually, you know, Ukraine is a democracy.
I totally agree with that.
It is a democracy. Petro Poroshenko, the incumbent president who lost to Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019, he really didn't want to lose that election. He wanted to win. Ukrainians actually, if we pay attention, are reminding us what our own values are about. They're about self-determination. They're about decency. And you talk to any Ukrainian soldier on the front line and you say, why are you fighting? And they say, I'm fighting for my kids, for my wife, for my elderly parents, for my village, for my family, for my, for freedom, for my way to be the way I want to be. And, you know, normally that would be platitudinous, but when you're standing in a trench with artillery flying over and, the Russians close by, that actually is very moving. And I think we just have to salute Ukrainians for their bravery, and we have to keep supporting them.
I'm glad you got your applause in, because I was going to push back a little bit on that. Two things. One is, because you've been doing this long enough and can give us that historical perspective, both of you, and there are young people in the room who didn't grow up with the Cold War. Is this a completely different thing to the Cold War? Is this post-ideological? Is this about something else? It's not about defending communism or supporting communist regimes abroad. Neither is it, from the other side, really about liberal values. And that's the second point I wanted to push back against. If you're looking at this whole conflict sitting in Asia, anywhere in Asia, it looks very different. So China's rationale is, this is a post-Cold War situation. China's not fighting for communism. It's about self-interest. Maybe it's enlightened self-interest, but it is its own self-interest. India has been very clear that it needs oil for its vast population, and Russian oil exports have gone up. Crude's gone up to India. One of the Prime Minister's cronies has made a killing out of it. I mean, people have benefited from the extra oil imports, which have also been routed then to Europe via India. So there's a bit of oil washing going on in this entire scenario. So this dichotomy of black and white that we've heard so far perhaps has few more gray areas where it's not ideological, or is it ideological? Is it about different competing self-interests, and that's it?
Well, I agree with that to some extent, Mukulika, especially after a visit to India last year. First of all, I would say, no, it's not a second Cold War. It's something different. The world is hyper-connected. The internet in Russia is superb. In fact, I think it's better than the United States. Wherever I was, it worked perfectly, with no problem at all. In many regards, it's I walked into a bank in Ulan-Ude in the middle of Siberia, and it could have been Citibank on the Upper East Side of New York. I mean, it was gleaming, it was efficient, it was and so I was not a Cold War. No, I don't think so. I was when I was in Belgorod, which is very tense, where there's fighting nearby at the border. I was looking at these displaced people from a town called Shebekino, 40,000 of them who've been displaced and are lining up outside sports centers and cultural centers for food. And there was one guy wearing, a couple of guys actually wearing an NYC blue cap. There was another guy with a Los Angeles T-shirt. I mean, this is not the Russia of 30 plus years ago. I think there is an ideological battle of some kind going on. I mean, Putin is trying very hard to portray this as a conflict between his conservative ideology of church, family, patriotism, a marriage is between a man and a woman, making it very hard for homosexuals in Russia to go about their lives, against a decadent West in his portrayal of it. I mean, you don't get through more than 2 conversations in Russia without hearing about how everyone in the West is gender transitioning and how LGBTQ has basically taken over the whole of the West, and it's a decadent society which has forsaken God, forsaken family, forsaken any values. And there's talk now of, when the Constitution was written under Yeltsin, there was a clause, the 13th clause, that was added stating that there could be no state ideology in Russia, obviously following communism. I don't think there is such a thing in any other constitution in the world, but according to the Russian constitution, there can be no state ideology. They are now in the Duma in the process of trying to remove this in order to insert words to the effect of what I've just been saying, that this is the new Russian ideology. It's not, however, a Cold War. I do agree with you, Mukulika, about I heard a lot in Africa when I was in Central African Republic last year and in India. Why does the West care so much when the people being killed are white? We have plenty of wars. Does anybody pay any attention to our wars? No, they don't. It's all very well for Europe to, for the West, the colonizer, to tell us that we should view this conflict in a certain way. I mean, to us, it's clear that this is a Russian colonial war of a kind. But in Africa, it's not seen that way. The colonizers are the UK and France, and God knows those countries did colonize a lot, including in India. So I think, yeah, I agree. I think we have to be careful. The world is changing. If it's the West and the rest is getting stronger, and the rest views are not our own. And I think the danger of contempt, whether it's in domestic politics in the United States, where there's a tendency to dismiss the tens of millions of Americans who vote for Trump as just stupid. No, they're not stupid. They think differently. And they do some, on the fringes, they do appalling things. But to view how the rest, if you like, how people in Africa, people in India, people in China view this conflict, to just dismiss it, I think would be wrong. I think we in the West have to think about it very hard.
I hate to slightly disagree with you.
No, please do. It's better when. I hate it when panelists agree on everything.
I revere you, but
mutual, Luke.
Just on the kind of Cold War thing, all I can tell you is about my personal experiences in Moscow, which is that within 4 months of arriving in Russia as the Guardian's bureau chief in 2007, I found myself being tailed by rather curious, unpromising young men wearing cheap, dark black leather jackets and brown shoes who would follow me into restaurants and this is in the pre-iPhone era, put sort of bags with listening devices next to me. We had repeated break-ins into our family apartment in Moscow by the FSB. We were advised by the British Embassy. And they left these stupid, dumb, obvious sub-Sherlock Holmes clues that they'd been in there. They would delete family photos. They would open windows next to my son's bedroom when we lived on the 9th story, which they broke open, implying he was 6 at the time, that he might fall out. We were told by the British Embassy that there was video surveilling us, including in the bedroom. Where my wife and I kind of made jokes, carried on, because you have to live, right? And it felt like it was a bit sub-John le Carré, but it did feel very Cold War, and I was interrogated at one point by the FSB in Lefortovo, which is the jail cum detention center wherever even Gershkovitz is being kept, which had kind of etiolated carpets, a camera that on the ceiling that tracked your movements, an officer who took my mobile phone with a mirrored screen where I just saw his hand, and the hand was very hairy. This is all kind of Cold War stuff, and the more serious point is that Putin thinks in classic KGB conspiratorial terms. His worldview is a prioristic, that America is an enemy, that the West is out to encircle and devour Russia, that that Russia is the author of nothing, that everything it does is defensive and reactive, and so on. So I think a lot of his thinking is shaped by the KGB. And just one other quick point is that I agree with Roger that actually his thinking is classically 19th century and imperial. The world that Putin wants is one where great powers meet in smoky rooms with a map, and they divide Europe into zones of influence, where big countries can overrun smaller countries, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine, where values don't exist. So it's this strange kind of postmodern mashup between sort of Cold War, neo-Cold War, and classic imperial thinking. And it's dangerous, and it's potent, and it's got us to where we are.
Thank you for that. Just to clarify, I think your portrayal of Russia, there's very little to quarrel with that. Though I don't know whether they were quite as amateurish during the Cold War. If you read Le Carré, they were slightly better and a little more subtle than you described.
I mean, just to say, it was deeply unpleasant.
Yeah,
sure. And the idea was psychological, and it was to make us leave.
Yeah, the one adjective that Luke that you used about the Russians that I would quibble with was stupid.
Yeah.
I don't think the Russians are stupid. I think Putin has turned Russia into a very, very menacing and dangerous place where freedom has been pretty much completely crushed at this point. But I think it's very dangerous to underestimate them.
No, I'm not.
Yeah,
I agree with
yeah,
you. I'm not underestimating. I'm just talking about playbook.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I have a question which I think it will be nice to pose, but I'm going to pose it and then take some questions from the floor, because I realize people will want to ask theirs, and then maybe you can weave in the question. But what I wanted you both to talk about was also all of us, most of us here, are consumers of the news that both of you and your colleagues write, and we're all very aware how thin on the ground reporting is getting. Newspapers, you said you were the only American journalist in Russia. Luke, you're inviting random strangers to come and be war reporters in Kyiv. That's as difficult as it's getting. But what is the situation of international reporting, the fact that bureaus are getting smaller and smaller for overseas reporting, as much, not just because of budgetary pressures, but because of pressures from governments? We know this is certainly happening in India, as is very evident with the BBC case, that the government of India didn't like the documentary BBC produced on the Prime Minister and has been out to the BBC. And this is not by any means an isolated case. So what are the pressures of producing stories from the ground?
Yeah, I think there are enormous pressures. I mean, everything is... I started out filing by telex from Beirut, feeding paper into a telex machine. So in 1982, during the war there, at the Commodore Hotel. So everything has changed in journalism, but everything. But in a curious way, I think also nothing has changed. I mean, there is no substitute for what Luke and I have been doing on either side of late of the Ukrainian-Russian front line / border, which is boots on the ground, seeing with your own eyes, listening, feeling, touching, all your senses at work, just trying to fathom what is going on. What is going on? What is going on? And then trying to render that as powerfully, as clearly, as fairly, as evocatively as possible. There's a lot of talk of objectivity and actually a lot of fights in the United States over the word objectivity now. There's a lot of dismissal of both sides journalism as a cop-out. I'm still a believer in both sides journalism, but I've never really been a believer in the word objectivity. Fairness, yes, but you know, each of us is human. Each of us brings to what we do our own sensitivities, our own life stories, and and I've always been most interested in trying to tell wider stories through the stories of individual human beings. Indeed, the book I wrote about Bosnia was constructed around 4 or 5 families. It's a menacing time for journalism. More and more journalists are being arrested, detained, like Evan Gershkovich, around the world. There are budgetary pressures. The New York Times has actually, after a very critical period around 2010, when the whole business model of journalism changed and print advertising basically died overnight, which was the main source of revenue for most newspapers. So reinventing a whole business on the fly is not easy. And it was touch and go. But we've come out of it very strong with almost 10 million online subscriptions now, and a target of growing that very substantially over the next several years. And the newsroom of the New York Times has actually never been bigger than it is now. With, I don't know the exact figures, but I think more than 1,600 journalists and more bureaus across the world. You know, we're selling subscriptions in interesting ways. The buzzword these days is bundling. Maybe you don't know what bundling is. Bundling is very important in journalism now. Bundling means you subscribe to the New York Times and you get New York Times Cooking, you get Wordle, which the New York Times bought about a year ago, and Wordle is very prominent in our bundling these days and other things. So it works, you know, and if it, you know, it pays. By having all those subscriptions, we're able to continue doing the journalism we do. It goes much faster, much faster. It's audio, it's video, it's often live, which means that you're getting bursts of 300-word updates, for example, on the counteroffensive.
What's the word for it?
Pardon?
What's the word for it, you said?
It's called live, and we go live when there's some big event unfolding, like the dam, for example, the breach in the dam. You know, it can be, I mean, everything's moving faster. I'm definitely not. So it can be somewhat disconcerting, but...
Thanks, Roger. Let's get, and I want to take some.
Oh yeah, just very briefly. The problem is that the world is going dark, actually, for a lot of newspapers. We have, after Evan Gershkovich was arrested, you know, my colleague in Moscow left. So there are no British print journalists in Moscow, and I think... Or American. So Moscow, dark. Beijing, we have no one. We've been trying for about 2 years to get a visa. We have a China affairs correspondent. We have someone in Taipei, but we have no one in China. India...
and our bureau is also radically reduced.
Right. India, we let's say we've had a few problems and leave it at that. So these are very big, very important, very populous countries, and we to use the phrase of today, we have no boots on the ground. I just want to say one other thing. I mean, I agree with Roger passionately. There is no substitute for being there. And my book, Invasion, I wrote in between stints on the front line. So I would come back shell-shocked, exhausted, exuberant, furious, tearful, and I would write. And I would write about Bucha, I'd write about Mariupol, I'd write about Ukraine's horizontal society, I'd write about Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, I'd write about Zelensky, I'd write about the psychopathy of Putin. And actually, I find it quite cathartic. It's a form of, my book is the first draft of history, but it's also a form of literary revenge, perhaps, or literary truth-telling. And I like Roger, I believe in fairness, but I also believe in truth.
I would just say that I totally agree with that, Luke. I mean, everybody has something that makes them tick, and in my case, and obviously in Luke's too, it's writing. And when there's something inside you that is obsessing you and won't let you go, it just won't let you go, the only solution for me is to write. And indeed, when I came out of Bosnia, the reason I wrote a book is that I couldn't move on from seeing what I'd seen. There's something voyeuristic about journalism. You write some great story about some desperate family and it's on page 1 above the fold, and then you go. And the family's still there, and the suffering's still there. And for me, and perhaps for Luke too, I think writing a book, writing a book is like having a baby. You know, you don't know what's going to happen to the baby.
My God, I've had 9 babies.
Right.
Actually, we should do questions, Roger, shouldn't we? Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. Is that right?
But it's out there, you know, and you don't know who might pick it up one day. And I think writing is it's not really a choice, and it's no fun. It's agony. It's just agony. But it can be rewarding.
Thank you. I think we have time to take a couple of questions, maybe, and then you can... Okay, I'm going to go with the young people in the room, just for the interest of fairness. So let's start with one here and one here.
Hi, thank you very much. When you're writing about events that are unfolding in real time, how do you decide which context to apply to the articles you're writing?
Okay, so can we take both questions and then both of you can answer? Yeah.
So my question was really quick. I wanted to know your thoughts. You spoke on Russia's ideological roots and basis in this conflict. I wanted to know if you thought the West and its discourse on democracy, human rights, liberal values, that rhetoric, if you see that as ideological or as purely circumstantial based on what's happening in Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, I think we can slip in one more question if anyone else has a question at the back.
I can remember 3 questions.
You can.
I'll remember. That's my job as chair.
Thank you. I'm actually not all that young, so I just wanted to find out from both of you what impact you think artificial intelligence will have on journalism and the future of journalism and boots on the ground.
Well, I better go first because I will forget. No, just very quick. What context? I think I was trained in a wire service at Reuters, and you're trained to write fast on deadline. That's part of being a pro, which for a journalist is the highest compliment, to be a pro, to get it done. Because however good the piece is, it's no good if you don't get it in by deadline. In terms of context, I mean, you read, I think you need to read history. You can't go to Russia and not read history, try it on. Same with Ukraine. I mean, this is a long, tangled history, which in the telling goes back to, the foundation of Rus in Kyiv in the year 900 or whenever it was, 800, 900, and it's been entangled ever since, and it was kind of the same in the Balkans. So you read, or you learn, you teach yourself. Values, I think it's what we believe. I don't think it's some I think it's what our societies are built around. And once, as in Hungary, you start destroying a free press and eliminating the independence of the judiciary and turning your economy into a crony economy where everything is given as favors to the people who support you, then you move toward illiberalism and the destruction of our societies in ways that make elections just a kind of rote procedure to be got through where the outcome has become inevitable. So no, I think it's absolutely fundamental to who we are. AI, I'm terrified of it, but I really can't say anything about it.
Yeah, I'm terrified too, and maybe next year you come back and we've been replaced by chat, GPT, avatars. I mean, who can do better Roger Cohen columns than Roger Cohen? I mean, that is the nightmare that keeps us awake at night. I mean, I agree with all that. On values and democracy, the same. I mean, I've knocked around the world, and whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Ukraine, actually, people pretty much want the same thing. They want jobs, they want healthcare, they want their kids to have a decent education, they want representative government where politicians come and go rather than staying forever. And it's not simple. I mean, I think it's not difficult. I think it just comes from people's basic yearning. And on context, all I would say is that I agree with Roger, and I've been reading terrifically Ukrainian novels and books. There's been a huge rebasing, both of journalism away from Moscow towards Kyiv, but also of area studies that Russia and East European studies doesn't really work anymore. These countries, whether it's Ukraine or other post-Soviet states, have got their own intellectual traditions. The Ukrainians have got Cossacks. They've got this tradition of disputatiousness, of anarchy going back to the 17th and 18th century. They are not Russians. They will tell you they're not Russians, and it's true. So I would just recommend, at the moment I'm reading Gogol. I recommend Serhiy Zhadan, who writes brilliant books, including The Orphanage, Taras Shevchenko's poems. Serhiy Plokhy has done a great book called The Russo-Ukrainian War, which just came out. So read, and read something different.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. So if there is, we'll take one from you, Parvez.
Mike is coming.
My name is Parvez Alam. Just a quick one. Both of you have painted a scenario as if Putin is going to last at least for the next 10 years. What if he dreams tomorrow, Trump has come back, has won the election, and Putin dies in sheer excitement tomorrow, suppose. What is the alternative post-Putin death?
Oh, okay. So did you have a question? Yeah, and then we're going to sneak in, because he's a friend of mine, so we're going to sneak in a question. Yeah.
Kind of related in a sense. You've given this real sense of Putin being entrenched. But how much of that is based on real popularity? And is there real popularity for this war in Russia? We get these figures that are saying 95% and things like that, but that must be untrue, I hope.
Okay, and one final question here.
Yeah, with the rise of all the strong men and only men, which are there, Hungary, Turkey was mentioned, India, China, I mean, we can go on. It is changing the landscape of journalism, but also changing the landscape of information that's available to the local population within the countries, and also then reflects in the changing of public opinion. I mean, if the public opinion here changes about the war in Ukraine, if the public opinion was never existed in the war in Yemen, then nothing has happened. But does that affect how we proceed going forward? And how does it affect the so-called democratic institutions and environment that we see going forward?
Actually, on men, Russia was governed almost entirely by women in the 18th century, but culminating with Catherine the Great. But then that came to an end. On Putin and his death, Madame de Stael commented that Russia is an autocracy tempered by assassination. That was her view of how Russia functioned. I don't foresee that happening in Putin's case, but he will die. He will die. I can confidently assert that he will die. I suspect he will be in office until he dies, probably. And, what comes after him, or, in any system as completely autocratic as Russia is now, the opacity is enormous. I mean, the Kremlin today is a black box. We're back to the days of Kremlinology. I talked to a number of ambassadors in Moscow. They know nothing about what's going on. Very, very little. I mean, it's reading the tea leaves. I mean, there is very, very little to go on. So who might be? Certainly, Putin has not indicated or prepared any successor. And Medvedev, who did that little choreographed dance with him, whereby Medvedev became president, he has gone completely. He's in sort of Looney Tunes zone these days, making crazy statements about nuclear war. So that's not going to happen. I don't think we can possibly know, and I think it would be unwise to predict that the Russian situation might improve, post-domestic situation might change or improve, but it could. It's not impossible. The 90s did happen. There was a moment of fervid hope, and Russia, like France, is a turbulent society, so we can't know. Quickly, popularity. Well, the opinion polls say around 80%. You're dealing with a very cowed population. 1 million people at least who think differently and oppose the war have left. They're not there anymore. There's certainly, there are a lot of people who are poor, a lot of people who are disgruntled, not that happy, maybe not so much about the war, but just about their general situation, and that's very hard to calculate. But Putin has a solid core of cowed support, I would say, that is pretty high. And he wants this war to run until the election in March. There are 2 elections next year, Russia and the United States. And Putin has re-engineered the constitution so he can get 2 more 4-year terms, 6-year terms, right? Yeah, he can get to 2036, by which time he will be well into his 80s. And the strongmen. What was the question about the strongmen?
The question was about how do people in the countries get news that is reliable?
Right. Well, I mean, if they can access international media, The Guardian, The New York Times, BBC, sometimes you can use VPNs to reach even sites that are, and there are a lot of, in the Philippines, in Russia, there are heroic people, who believe passionately, and elsewhere, who believe passionately in a strong, independent, free media. But yeah, I agree, it's a menacing time, and I think what we do has never been more important.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it brief. Just to say, the problem is we've all watched The Death of Stalin, the wonderful Armando Iannucci film, and we think, oh, it's got to be like The Death of Stalin. Unfortunately, I think it's not going to be like The Death of Stalin, but I do agree with Roger that Putin will make a kind of what you might call a sort of Brezhnevian exit horizontally from the Kremlin at some point. And last year there were these kind of rumors swirling that he was ill. You've seen him walking. He walks very strangely. He was gripping the table. I even asked President Zelensky about this. And I'm afraid the bad news, what I can tell you is I've spoken to various European foreign intelligence agency chiefs, and they say the only fact we know about Vladimir Putin's health is he has the best medical care in the world. Basically, he has a team of doctors on standby whenever anything is vaguely amiss who are there to tend for him. So waiting for him to croak is not strategy, and I think it's not going to happen anytime soon. And also, if, to go to your man-woman question, if there is a successor, I can tell you, first of all, it won't be a woman. It'll be another small man, probably. And, to be frivolous, the line of succession, I mean, you're a student of history, Roger, it's normally bald man, hairy man. So Yevgeny Prigozhin...
No, in the United States, it's always hairy man.
It's always hairy man. Okay, Yevgeny...
You cannot be bald and be elected in the
Okay.
Well, Eisenhower.
Okay,
if you're a general, maybe.
Let's not go there with Trump. But anyway, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who seems to have presidential ambitions and looks like a Bond villain straight out of, some kind of evil cave, is very bald. So I think it's not going to be Prigozhin, but it will be someone else. And I'm afraid someone else with the same complexes. And democracy in Russia is a long way off. But I hope, Roger, maybe the 3 of us can go on our Zimmer frames sometime and go around Free Red Square. but it's not going to be this year.
Actually, do I have 1 second? I just wanted to tell you, mentioning Brezhnev reminded me of a story. At a certain point in Russia, I decided to get a haircut. And so I went to some barber, and he starts trimming my eyebrows. And I said to him, oh, well, it was very, he spoke very limited English. But I said, oh, he said, yes. On Brezhnev. He didn't want me to look like Brezhnev, so he decided on his own accord to trim. And Putin on hell, I was on the Macron trip where they sat at the either end of that enormous table. I mean, he is because he didn't want to get anywhere near any potential source of germs. Yeah, so he's pretty obsessed by that. Yeah, and. Well, look at Khamenei in Iran, speaking of people going on and on and on and on. People were predicting his demise a long time ago.
And Erdogan has just won another term, so they're alive and well and kicking. I think we were trying levity, but we didn't really manage. Thank you for the Brezhnev joke, but that's all we managed. I'm sorry, we don't have time for
I think we did better than that.
Did you? Okay,
Well,
if you say
I'm sure
so.
a few people laughed.
Thank you very much.